Hi everyone, thank you all for being here. Today we have Julia Lerch, in giving a talk on one of the most recent projects on freedom in academia, which I'm sure it will be of interest to a lot of you, and maybe some of you will have very concrete examples of what it means or doesn't mean. And Julia holds a PhD from Stanford University and is now an assistant professor at the University of California, Irvine. And I'll let her talk about this fascinating project.
Thank you so much, Juliette. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for this very kind introduction. I'm just going to load my presentation. So yeah, I'm just so pleased to be here. Thanks everyone for joining. I know it's late in the day for everyone. I'm really eager to present this paper, to hear your feedback and suggestions. And so in the interest of time, I think I'll just dive straight into the paper and the presentation so we can get to our discussion. All right, so the backdrop to my presentation today is something that I think is probably, not new to any of you, right, as people working in higher education, which is that I think universities have really become sort of enormously important institutions the world over, right? So over time, there's been a rather sort of dramatic university expansion, right? More and more people have been going to higher education. There are overall more and more higher education institutions. And I think there's also been a sort of real proliferation in the domains of our lives that are governed by university knowledge and by academics. And so, I think in many ways, it's not an exaggeration to say that the university and academic knowledge sort of holds in many ways an unprecedented authority in our contemporary lives, right? And so countries around the world, I think, look to universities and to higher education to build quote unquote knowledge economies, for instance, right? Now, at the same time, I think it's also true that we periodically see sort of sometimes quite forceful reactions against this authority of the university, right? And I think we only really have to look to sort of recent news headlines, right, to see instances where, often political actors are sort of trying to reassert control over the university and trying to sort of rein in academics and academic knowledge. And so I'll just throw out a few sort of recent examples from the news. So a good recent example was in 2016 in the aftermath of an attempted coup in Turkey, where the government really persecuted thousands of academics and academic staff and students, right? And I think in many ways, this wasn't an isolated incident, right? I think overall, the Erdogan regime has really tried quite systematically to sort of take control of the higher education sector. We also have some good recent examples from Brazil, where Bolsonaro has attacked universities sort of quite forcefully sometimes, slashing funding, attacking especially sort of the humanities and social sciences as being these bastions of leftist indoctrination, sort of voicing discontent with affirmative action programs. We've also seen violent attacks on university campuses in India by Hindu nationalists that have been sort of linked to the Modi regime, right? And I think, again, the Modi government has sort of tried to reassert some control over higher education, for instance, accusing scholars that are studying Kashmir to be doing quote unquote anti-national research. And then I think a final example comes from China, where there have been sort of reports of tightening controls over the higher education sector, right? Some textbooks being banned, students sort of being deployed as watchdogs in classrooms, and sometimes dissident professors sort of let go. And these are just a few examples, right? I think there are many more, including, for instance, very recently in the United States, in Florida, some attempts to prevent academics from testifying in a voting rights lawsuit, right? And so I think the important point is that even in an era when I think in many ways the university and academia and academic knowledge holds sort of unprecedented authority in the world, this authority is far from uncontested, right? And so against that backdrop, the paper that I want to share with you today looks at a sort of the cross-national evolution of academic freedom since the 1960s as one lens into this sort of evolving authority of the university vis-a-vis other institutions, right, that also vie for authority. And I think in an earlier era that was maybe perhaps especially religious authorities and the church, right? But I think in the contemporary and sort of modern world, it's been mainly the national state. This is it's a co-authored paper, co-authored with some dear colleagues at UCI, David Frank and Evan Schofer. It is a working paper, so it's very much in progress, and I'm sort of eager, to hear from you what you think. Now, of course, there is an existing literature on academic freedom, right, that I think provides really important sort of context for our paper. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on, but I would say in a nutshell, a lot of the sort of existing literature is really thinking quite domestically, right? So academic freedom around the world is sort of very much seen as shaped by the particularities of particular national contexts, right? And maybe most dramatically, a country's form of government. And I think that's a really important storyline, right? But I also think there's something that sort of gets lost when we're thinking about academic freedom just through a sort of domestic or nation-focused lens. And I think we know that higher education sectors don't exist in isolation, right? We know that countries look to each other. They look to international organizations for sort of models or norms and scripts for what a university can and should look like, right? And so to complement the sort of domestic storylines that mark a lot of the existing literature, the story that I want to tell, over the next half hour or so is a much more global one, right? And really sort of starting with this idea that higher education and the academy isn't just sort of shaped from below, right, through local and national sort of processes, but also from above by sort of norms and ideas that circulate in the international system about what a legitimate university sort of looks like. And so I'm going to be thinking a little bit about the ways that academic freedom is shaped by sort of the evolving mix of norms in the international system, the ways that countries are connected to those. And in particular, I'm going to be thinking about sort of the ebb and flow of liberal norms in the international arena and on the world stage. I'm going to be thinking a little bit about global eras of illiberal challenges, and then think a little bit about the extent to which countries are sort of connected to liberal norms and ideas in the system versus sort of alternative ones, right? And with sort of varying implications for academic freedom. Okay, so before I go into the meat of the argument, I wanted to just say a few words about how we're thinking about academic freedom in the paper. Now, in many ways, academic freedom it's an old concept, right, with a sort of long history, right? It has contested definitions, and I think as many of you will know, the university is just an enormously old institution, right? And so I think even in its sort of medieval era, there was a real sense that the university is a kind of unique place, right, that needed some degree of autonomy. Earlier sort of from ecclesial and religious authorities, right? But then later on with the rise of the modern nation state system, sort of from the nation state. So I don't want to go too much into these definitional issues, but I do want to note that usually folks sort of conceptualize academic freedom as having at least sort of two dimensions. One dimension which sort of harks back to Humboldtian notions and the sort of German legacy is the idea of freedom within the university, right? So the absence of administrative constraints on teaching, on learning, and freedom of inquiry, right? But there's also a dimension of academic freedom outside of the university, right? And this is something that's been especially important in the United States. So academic civil and political freedoms, right? There's freedom of expression outside of the academy. And then I think there's also a really important institutional dimension, right, that I think is really intimately connected with academic freedom. So ideas of the self-governance and the autonomy of universities. And I think that's been a powerful force, especially in the Latin American tradition, right? And so I realized that there are nuances and differences between all these different dimensions, right? But for the purposes of the talk and the paper, we're thinking about academic freedom very, very broadly, right, as encompassing all these dimensions. And you'll see later on that the measure that we're using is equally broad. Now, along with, I would say a long-standing debate about the meaning of academic freedom, scholars have also long debated the foundations of academic freedom, right? What shapes academic freedom? And of course, there are many explanations out there, right? It's a varied literature, but I do think in very broad strokes, we can say that a lot of the existing literature is thinking about the issue bottom up. So very much thinking about nation-state characteristics, right, that are shaping academic freedom. It's very much a domestic lens. So for instance, there's a really rich literature on the, oftentimes very severe restrictions on academic freedom that are imposed in autocratic states, right, and even dictatorial ones, right? And I think we can all think of historical examples like Nazi Germany, but also contemporary ones, right? There are a lot of case studies that show that when a country finds itself in times of war, right, be it a civil war or be it an international conflict like the Cold War, it often has detrimental effects on freedom within the academy, right? And so it's a time when states often grow more coercive, they grow more secretive, and increase their powers of surveillance. And then lastly, I think another common imagery is this idea that in places where religious authorities hold a lot of political power, right, it can often restrict academic freedom and the autonomy of higher education institutions. As I said earlier, I think this is maybe less the case in the contemporary world, but of course, it's still present, and certainly historically, that's been a major dynamic. Now, I think these domestic storylines are really, really important, and they tell us a lot about academic freedom, and you'll see measures for these in the analyses that I'll show you later. But I'm also not quite sure that they tell the full story, right? I think there's something that gets lost when we're looking at the issue domestically, and this becomes increasingly clear, I think, when we're looking at some cross-national patterns of academic freedom. So what you see in this graph are world and regional graphs of academic freedom, the evolution of academic freedom over time from the 1960s to today. I'll say more later, but the data comes from a very new index of academic freedom. It's very, very broad, capturing all the kind of dimensions that I talked about earlier. And there's really two kind of key things that I want to highlight about this picture. So one is that obviously there are cross-national differences, right? Like, it is very clear that there are differences around the world in terms of the degree to which academic freedom is respected, right? There is no doubt about that. But I think the graphs are also suggestive of maybe a more shared kind of supranational or global trend that is also present, right? And so we can see that there's some kind of shared trend across the regions, across the world, even if it has variations, right? And so we can see that academic freedom on average was low, you know, even declining during the sort of Cold War era. Then sort of late 1980s during the and then sort of 1990s immediate post-Cold War era, there's a boost, right? And then we see a sort of flattening out, and in some cases even sort of decline in the 21st century. And so that to me suggests that, you know, a sort of purely national lens is not enough to explain what's going on. And so I want to develop these sort of global dimensions a little bit more in the next few slides. And so I'm starting here with an insight that, you know, I think is really well established in the literature on higher education and on education more generally, which is that national higher education systems are really embedded and shaped by the sort of wider environments in which they find themselves, right? And in particular, the global context really matters, right? Especially in an era of globalization. So the global context provides sort of norms or models that shape schools and universities, right? Through sort of international organizations or through countries sort of modeling in the international arena. And so, for instance, we know from the existing literature that, you know, part of what sort of promoted the really dramatic university expansion that we saw over the course of the 20th century was in part international organizations, right, ranging from UNESCO to the World Bank, that really came to see higher education as sort of essential for development, right? We also know that university curricula, so for instance, the emergence of new fields of study, they spread around the world, right? And they diffuse globally in ways that are not necessarily sort of reducible to domestic contexts, right? And I think the same is true of universities' organizational forms, right? So there's been a wave of university privatization around the world in the neoliberal era, right? And I think, again, sort of promoted by, in part at least, international organizations. And so this idea that the university is shaped by the global context is really well established in the literature, right? Now, where we depart from the literature and try to sort of expand and push it forward is that we want to think a little bit more deeply about contestations in the global environment, right? And I think in many ways, you know, it is not unfair to say that a lot of the existing scholarship has sort of implicitly assumed that global norms are liberal. And I here mean liberal sort of in the broad sense of emphasizing individual liberties, right? Be it in the economy, be it in the polity, or in sort of the social world, right? So for instance, people might have looked at the spread of human rights programs in universities, right? And so I think this liberal bent in much of the literature is maybe not surprising, right, given the sort of rise and influence of the liberal international order over the course of the 20th century. But increasingly, scholars are sort of grappling with and trying to make sense of illiberal contestations in the global context, right, and thinking sort of about challenges to the liberal model that unfold not just in the domestic space, right, but also in the global element. And so, for example, some of the folks that I've cited here, Hadler and Simmons and Chris Velasco, have written about how opposition to liberal gender and sexuality norms sort of plays out in the international sphere, right, with anti-LGBT activists sort of mobilizing using international networks, using international discourses. Much more broadly, there's a large-scale research cluster in Germany called Scripts, which is led by Tanja Börzel and Michael Zürn, that's really looking at contestations of the liberal script and the liberal international order in all kinds of domains, right, ranging from the economy to democracy and the political sphere to sort of the social sphere. And so the important point is that, you know, the global context is sort of periodically marked by contestations and by challenges, right? And so in many ways, I think if we're looking sort of over the past half century, I think the global context has really been marked by sort of a changing mix of not just liberal, but also illiberal sort of institutions and norms. And I think these have offered quite different models of the university. with sort of varying support for academic freedom. And so I just want to unpack this evolving global context a little bit more in just a few slides. So the analyses that I'm going to show you in a moment, they start in the 1960s. So, you know, this is sort of the decades after the end of World War II, right? And in many ways, I think this was a global context that was quite conducive to academic freedom, right? So as I mentioned, this was an era when sort of international institutions and normative foundations for sort of post-World War II global order were very much being built up, right? The United Nations, the UDHR, right? And I think very much sort of built around liberal models and norms, right? Emphasizing things like liberal democracy and like human rights. And I think with respect to academic freedom, sort of the important point here is that I think by virtue of their emphasis on individual liberties, liberal models sort of generally delegitimate sort of extensive nation-state control over all kinds of social institutions, right? But I think also including universities. And so I think this is a sort of period and when extensive state censorship of universities was sort of less legitimate, right? And I think even one of the international institutions, UNESCO, would later develop a recommendation to support academic freedom, right? And so in some sense, this was a global context that was quite conducive. But then, of course, this was also the period of the Cold War, right? And so I think the liberal model was far from hegemonic in the international sphere, right? The Soviet Union and countries in its sphere of influence provided an alternative model, right, for how to organize the economy, how to organize the polity, how to organize the social world. That was also really legitimate, right? And it was internationally quite influential. And so even though the Soviet Union, of course, participated in sort of mainstream international institutions, it also built up its own international structures, right? Like the Warsaw Pact and like a Comic-Con. You know, and I think the university and science more broadly and the academy is very important for development in the communist model, right? And in many ways, the Soviet Union and sort of countries in the Soviet bloc really built up their higher education sectors, right? But it was a much more sort of tightly controlled model of the university, you know, with overall, I think, much less sort of organization around academic freedom. And I think partly, you know, this was an autocratic effect, right? But I think more broadly, it's also sort of connected to the dynamics around sort of a manpower planning model of the university, right? Where the university is sort of largely seen as, in many ways, sort of subservient to the needs of the national state, right? And, you know, this is not to say that attacks on academic freedom didn't happen in the West during that era, right? Of course they did, and a really good example from the United States is McCarthyism, right? But I do think that overall it's sort of fair to say that the communist model envisioned a sort of more tightly controlled university. And so in many ways, you know, this is an era of global contestation where I think the liberal model is far from uncontested. Now, of course, you know, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think the alternative, the main alternative, sort of experienced a major collapse, right? I think what we see in the sort of immediate post-Cold War era is that liberal models become incredibly dominant in the international system, right? I do think there's a veritable sort of sense that, quote unquote, there is no alternative to the liberal model, right? Scholars could sort of proclaim the end of history. And I think in many ways, this was an era of sort of quite extensive liberalization around the world, right? So for instance, there was a third wave of democratization that swept the world, right? And I think in many ways, this was a global context that sort of really reduced the legitimacy of sort of alternative models of the university, right? You might call them illiberal, that are built around sort of strong nation state control and even censorship, right? And I think, this is not to say that the sort of unleashing of liberal forces during that era didn't bring challenges to higher education. I think it very much did, especially sort of the unleashing of globalized market forces. But I do think that, with respect to academic freedom, sort of this idea that the nation state or political actors could sort of with legitimacy just mold and bend the university around political or military ends, it did lose some sort of like purchase in the international system. Now, in hindsight, as I think is maybe often the case, the period of hegemony, was brief. I think what we've seen in the 21st century are sort of mounting challenges to the liberal model, right? Maybe especially since the 2008 economic crisis that I think sort of shook faith in the liberal system, right? So we've seen declines in democracy, we've seen sort of cracks in liberal international institutions. There's been a populist wave, right? And again, lots of people are thinking about these dynamics. And again, I think oftentimes thinking about the really important domestic manifestations. But I also think there's a really sort of interesting international dimension, which is that alternative models are sort of regaining an influence and legitimacy in the international arena, right? The liberal model is no longer sort of, the main game in town. And so, for instance, there's a burgeoning literature on the role of international alliances and networks that are built around more sort of authoritarian models of the state, right? So a really good example might be something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is sort of organized around notions of state security and sovereignty and respect for what it calls civilizational diversity. It's been described as providing a sort of counterweight to liberal democratic norms, right? And so I think in many ways the global context is sort of in flux, and I think this can be a global context where maybe censorship of universities is sort of more legitimate again, right? Because there are these sort of alternative models that are circulating in the international sphere that are maybe built around a more sort of authoritarian state, right? And that envision just a different kind of university, ones that are sort of much more sort of tethered to the national state. So let me try and just sort of tie things together a little bit. So the argument here is that, we can think about academic freedom not entirely, but at least in part, as sort of shaped by this ebb and flow of how dominant liberal norms are in the international arena over time, right? When are there sort of eras of illiberal challenges? And then we can also think a little bit about the degree to which different countries are sort of linked with these liberal ideas in the international system, right? Versus having sort of connections to alternative, and sometimes I would say sort of illiberal models that envision just a different kind of university. Okay, so let me say just a few words about sort of the empirical analyses. So the dependent variable here is a very new academic freedom index. It was just released in 2020 as part of the varieties of democracy data. We're using it here for the time period 1960 to 2015. And as you can see here, it's a very sort of broad measure of academic freedom, right? It encompasses numerous dimensions, including sort of all of the ones that I talked about just earlier in the presentation. Now, I should note that it's an expert coded measure, right? And so I'm happy to talk about sort of limitations in that, right? But in many ways, it's just a terrific new data source, and it's the best sort of cross-national and longitudinal quantitative data on academic freedom that we have. And I'm just really excited, that people did the legwork to collect this, and excited to be using it. Okay. So you'll see in a moment that I'm using sort of very simple time period variables to capture the global eras that I outlined a moment ago. So I want to, in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about sort of two key independent variables that we're using to try and capture country linkages to liberal global models versus sort of oppositional or alternative ones that are maybe a little bit less straightforward. And so with both of these, we're here drawing on, a long tradition in at least comparative sociology, but I think also political science of trying to sort of measure or proxy countries' linkages to norms in the international system by looking at their memberships in international organizations, right? And so for liberal global models, we're trying to proxy that by using a measure of country-level ties to international NGOs. So these are organizations like Amnesty International, right? And this is a measure that's sort of been routinely used in the literature to try and capture connections to dominant global norms. And I should note that, a lot of the existing literature sort of notes how, in many ways, international NGOs are very much a sort of liberal creature, right? As these free associations of individuals, they're underpinned by principles that are sort of, very much at the heart of the liberal model, maybe especially individualism. And so, it's a proxy, and, I realize it's an imperfect one, but it's one that's been commonly used. Now, in contrast, we try to sort of capture countries' connections or ties with oppositional or alternative models by looking at their memberships in international organizations that have a sort of documented record of legitimizing illiberal models. And given our particular case, we focused especially on international organizations that are sort of discussed in the literature as being built around a more sort of authoritarian model of the state. And so we went through the literature really carefully and identified sort of relevant organizations that were active in the time period that we're studying here. And our final list included 7 organizations, and we coded sort of annual membership for countries in those. They include organizations that are no longer around, right, but were active during the period of study, like the Warsaw Pact, but then also others that are still very much alive. The Commonwealth of Independent States, for instance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that I mentioned earlier. Another example is the Gulf Cooperation Council. And we coded membership relatively broadly, right, also including sort of observers, to try and capture these more sort of diffuse networks of influence. And so again, this is a proxy, and I'll return to this idea a little bit later on too. And, we keep trying to think about how to do this better, but it's a sort of stab at trying to measure these linkages to alternatives. Okay, just very, very briefly before I go into just sharing some, highlighting some key findings. Our data structure is in country year format, and so we're using panel regression models that are appropriate for this kind of data structure. Some that use country fixed effects, but others that use country random effects with regional controls, so we can control for that. And then our independent variables are lagged. Okay, so in the interest of time, I wanted to highlight, just a few sort of key. So what you see here are the results of a random effects model. The results from both models are, so that's great. I'm getting a message that my connection. Juliette, are you able to hear and see me?
You kind of breaking down a bit.
Okay.
Kind of leaving and reconnecting. It seems better now.
It seems better now? Okay, my apologies. Maybe for a moment I'll turn my video off and just see if that improves things. How does that sound?
Yes.
All right, my apologies. I feel like there's always something when you're giving an online presentation. But hopefully this works better, and please do, give me a heads up if you can't hear me. So let me, start again with this slide, because it seems like that's when the problem started to pop up. So what you see on this slide are the results for a country fixed effects model, and then also a random effects model with regional controls. The findings are very, very consistent across the two models, and so that's really good. In the interest of time, I wanted to just share a few sort of key findings. Right, so what you see boxed in here are the results for the time periods that I outlined a moment ago, right? So the reference category here is the sort of relatively brief post-Cold War era of liberal hegemony, and what what these findings show is that on average, levels of academic freedom were lower, not just during the sort of Cold War contestation, right, but also in the sort of more recent era of post-hegemony, right, when we're seeing sort of increasing challenges to the liberal script again. Here, roughly sort of demarcated by a post-2008 variable, right? And so, I think this is at least sort of some suggestive evidence that we can think of academic freedom as shaped in part by this sort of ebb and flow of how dominant liberal norms are in the international system, and when we're seeing sort of eras of contestation. But of course, we're also thinking a little bit about the different ways in which countries are connected to these, right? And so what you see boxed in here are the results for our proxy measure for country ties to liberal global norms, right? So membership in international NGOs. And you see here that the association with academic freedom is positive, right? So on average, levels of academic freedom sort of go up the more country ties a country has with these kinds of organizations. Now, in contrast, when we're looking at connections to alternative models that are also present in the international sphere, here proxied through our membership variable in quote-unquote illiberal international organizations, you see that the association is negative, right? And so on average, academic freedom sort of goes down with these connections. And, I should be very, very clear, as I said earlier, that, I'm thinking about these very much as proxies, right? So I think it's, it's unlikely that any of these particular organizations is sort of explicitly transmitting recipes for how to repress academics to its member states, right? But I think we can think of these connections as sort of proxies or stand-ins for what are in all likelihood sort of much more diffuse patterns of connectedness to these sort of circles or alliances and networks in the international system that are maybe more built around sort of international illiberal centers and sort of illiberal spheres of influence. Now, a final sort of disclaimer is that, none of this is to say that national features don't matter, right? They matter enormously for academic freedom, as I think we can see when we look at some of the other measures in the models, right? So what you see boxed in here are some of the national features that are routinely discussed in the literature, right? And so, it's very clear, for example, that a country's level of democracy matters enormously for academic freedom, right? So it's worth sort of keeping in mind or noting that this measure of democracy, it ranges from -10 to 10, right? So as countries move from being autocratic to democratic, it has a huge positive effect on academic freedom, right? And similarly, we can see that, if there's an armed conflict that's going on, it's overall not good news for academic freedom. We can also see that, if the state is sort of captured by religious influence, it overall, on average, sort of reduces academic freedom. So, the claim isn't that domestic features don't matter. They really do, right? But I think the story is a sort of more modest one, right? Above and beyond this sort of national features, there's something that's happening in the global environment and sort of supranationally that's also important, and that's worth sort of keeping in mind. Okay, let me just sort of share some concluding thoughts. So, starting with some of the sort of key contributions of the piece. And so, I think in many ways we are just hoping to add to the literature on academic freedom with a sort of relatively large scale cross-national longitudinal analysis, right? That I think is a nice sort of complement to a literature that's been by and large sort of very much case-based. Right, and so it's very much a bird's eye perspective on academic freedom, and I think it provides this really sort of interesting lens into the evolving autonomy and authority of the university over time. And I think the sort of main message that's coming from our paper is that we can think about academic freedom as not just sort of rooted and anchored in these domestic constellations, right? The global context also really matters because it provides legitimation for sort of particular models of the university, right? And some of them are conducive to academic freedom, but others may be less so, right? Thinking a little bit more broadly, I think we also add to the literature on sort of illiberal contestations, right? So as I mentioned earlier, there's sort of growing scholarly attention to contention over liberal models, and I think very often people are sort of thinking about classically liberal institutions, right? Like liberal democracy or markets. But, the university is not an inherently liberal institution, right? But I think these contestations also affect universities, and I think our paper sort of highlights that. And, I should note that I don't think it's the case that all parts of the university are sort of equally affected, right? I think, it's certainly true that there are some instances where illiberal opposition sort of try to completely suppress the university. And we can think of sort of, historical examples like maybe the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. More contemporaneously, I think the Hungarian government, for instance, has tried to sort of cut back on higher education enrollments, right? But I think the maybe more common pattern, especially in today's sort of world of the knowledge economy, is that I think illiberal oppositions just envision a different kind of university, right? So for instance, countries like Turkey and China have been growing their higher education sectors really quite aggressively, right? But it's sort of a different vision of the university, one that's more tightly sort of controlled. And I'll return to that in a moment. But I also wanted to acknowledge that I realize that the liberal frame itself can also present challenges to academic freedom, right? And so I think the sort of extensive emphasis on individual liberties that's involved, it can lead to all kinds of conflicting rights claims, right? For instance, between students versus teachers. But I think also, the market can represent a formidable challenge to academic freedom, so I recognize that. But I also think the measure that we have, it doesn't really get very well at these kinds of challenges. I think it's much better at sort of picking up political restrictions, and so I've sort of de-emphasized the other storyline here. But just a note that I do recognize that. And then, in the very final minute, I wanted to just highlight some sort of unresolved issues that at least for me have sort of been coming out of this work and that I've been trying to grapple with. And one, goes back to this idea of connecting academic freedom with sort of distinctive models of higher education expansion. So as I mentioned, just a moment ago, it's very, very clear that higher education expansion is not limited to liberal settings, right? But I do think the context really differs. And so I've been trying to collect study fields data, so higher education enrollments cross-nationally by field of study with one of my grad students, going back to the 1960s to try and sort of tease apart differences in the curriculum in higher education between sort of liberal versus illiberal models of higher education and of modernity, really. And sort of, in part thinking that maybe some subjects like engineering, right, are actually something that illiberal regimes are very sort of partial to, right? But others like the social sciences that are maybe, you know, subject to more restrictions because they're seen as a sort of threat. And then, you know, secondly and finally, I think there's also some really interesting questions around, you know, sort of what do low levels of academic freedom actually mean, right? So I've very much talked about it in the sense of repression, right? But I think we know from country cases that sometimes there is sort of some acquiescence that's also involved. And so in a recent case study on China, Elizabeth Perry has argued that, you know, rather than the university sort of representing this liberal island that has to be repressed, autocratic regimes can actually sort of thrive on academic allegiance. And so, you know, it's a really interesting twist to this sort of classic expectation that, you know, intellectuals are a positive force for democratization. But I think our academic freedom measure doesn't really get at those nuances very well. But there is also a new measure in the varieties of democracy data that sort of measures the degree to which academics protest the government. And so, you know, maybe this is sort of interesting path to try and explore some of those nuances. I'm going to close here in the interest of time. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that, you know, the technological breakdowns weren't too awful, and you can hear me okay. And I'm going to try sharing my video again. Hopefully that works okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Julia. Yeah, there were no further breakdown, and I don't think we missed too much. So thank you for the great and fascinating talk. So you, for the audience members, you'll be able to ask questions by raising your hand, and I'll start by a first question or two. My first question was thinking about the ways to go a bit further with these measures you have about membership in international non-governmental organization or these illiberal associations, and thinking if in terms of diffusion of norms, you could maybe do an interaction with the number of members, of country members in the association, or maybe with the date at which a country joins, like maybe something like almost like an event study in one case, trying to see if it's kind of in some sense first a drop in academic freedom, and then you join like a place where you will have, you know, support for your policies, or the other way around. And if it matters, like if it's like a 60 country organization, or like a 5-country organization, maybe standardizing by the number of relevant potential countries. What have you explored something like this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Juliet. That's a great question. And you know, I hadn't thought about this particular path forward. So I'm really appreciative of the suggestions to try and think a little bit about, you know, how large is this sphere of influence, right? Does it matter how long a country has been a member? So these are great. I will say that, you know, this is one of the measures where we keep, in many ways, it's been the bane of my existence with this paper, right? Because it's one of the ways that we're trying to sort of push the existing literature forward. But I think there's also so many ways that you could sort of envision improving the measure, right? And trying to sort of really capture what's going on. And so, you know, some of the things that we've been trying to think about, and I think we'll explore sort of alternative ways of arriving at the list of organizations, right? And also possibly introducing a little bit more over time variation by sort of, right now we went through the literature and sort of picked out organizations that were mentioned again and again, right? But an alternative way that people have tried to sort of identify these sort of autocratic clubs is by actually looking at sort of the average polity score, for instance, of like the members in the organization, right? And so you can identify a lot more organizations sort of empirically that way, right? And you could also imagine introducing over time variation, right, as sort of the makeup of the organization changes, right, and as the average polity score changes. and so I think that maybe ties in a little bit with the kinds of suggestions that you're making. I think in some sense, you know, there's been a sort of back and forth, because if we're using sort of the average polity score of members to identify organizations, then in some sense it's like, well, is it just about the national contexts, right? Is it just about the makeup, the country makeup, right? Is there nothing that's sort of going on above and beyond that? So yeah, thank you so much for that suggestion. And I think, you know, I'll add it to the list of things that we're going to try and do to try and turn this into a little bit more robust of a measure. So thank you. I see several hands up. I think, is that right? Matthias has his hand up.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Julia, for a fascinating talk, and I really enjoyed it. I have a more conceptual or theoretical question first, which is about to what I mean, obviously the way in which you use the concept of academic freedom, I mean, it's extremely broad, but I was wondering about the different dimensions you highlight and to what extent it would make sense to think about them separately. I mean, to give an example, during the period of liberal hegemony, one of the models was privatize, which certainly had an effect on the funding security of universities, both public and private. And then I would expect that the effect on institutional self-governance is not so clear whether it's positive. Whereas, obviously, with respect, the liberal hegemony period had, without doubt, a positive effect. I buy that on sort of the expression sphere outside the university, and maybe also inside. So, and the reverse. So, if you look at the illiberal contestation of academic freedom, and then you have countries such as Turkey or China pouring more resources into universities, creating greater funding security, which again, what's the effect on self-government? So what I'm saying is, would it make sense to unpack this big animal called academic freedom into different packs and parcels, and to tease out the processes, the global processes, the global models and their effects? Because in the moment it seems, you find these associations, but in my mind it's still not quite clear how these processes work for each dimension. But look, I have some nitpicky questions also on the operationalization of your independent variable, but I think we can hold off on that until later.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Matthias, for the thoughtful question. And it's something that I think we've been grappling with ourselves, right? And I think I love the way that you've sort of put this tension, right? Especially thinking a little bit about some of the sort of negative effects, possibly, of sort of the period of liberal hegemony, right? Which I think, I very much agree with. And I'll say I have looked at the models. This is going to be sort of an empirical answer to a conceptual question, but I have looked at the models sort of separately, right? So modeling each of the different indicators that makes up this index, modeling it separately, and there is a lot of consistency across the models, which I think is in some ways a little bit of an artifact of the expert coded nature of the measure. I think there's a tendency for all the indicators to hang together a little bit, right? Which I think can be an aspect of the sort of expert coding, rather than necessarily them not, there not being differences between these different dimensions. But I will say, especially sort of with respect to some of the things that you highlighted, there are some interesting differences. they're not necessarily in line with sort of the impact of, privatize, and maybe I should look at that more carefully because I haven't yet. But for example, this concept of institutional autonomy, as you mentioned, it does seem to be a little bit different. Right. So, for instance, one of the things that I noticed is that, being affected by armed conflict, it doesn't really seem to affect institutional autonomy, right? That's something that's a little bit more stable over time. So that's a sort of key difference. Also, I think conversely, sort of there's a measure in there about the degree to which campuses are sort of, surveilled for security, right? And armed conflict has a huge effect on that, right? And so I think some of the differences sort of make sense. And as you say, the freedom of academic expression, which is sort of, I think in many ways it's sort of a freedom of expression measure, right? Outside of the university, that's maybe picking up a lot of things that are not unique to the university sector. And that also works a little bit differently, right? That is especially affected, as you say, by some of the measures that we have for sort of liberal norms in the global system. And so just to say, I have looked into this sort of empirically. It wasn't quite as fruitful as I had hoped, which I think could be a little bit of an artifact of the nature of the data. But I think what we can do is at least sort of conceptually, I think as you have right now, try and add that complexity, right? And so I'm just very grateful for those notes. So thank you. All right. I hope I'm not missing people. I think I just see people kind of raising their hand one by one. So, Borge? Sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name.
He usually has bad Zoom days, so he might have bad BB Collab days. Borge, can you? We can't hear you, but you can. If it doesn't work, a bit, but very, very far. I go just. Okay, but maybe test your mic a bit further, and I'll ask if it's okay with you. I'll ask a question first, and then okay.
Okay.
Yes.
I hear something.
Shall I try again? Can you hear me now?
Yes, it works.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I have been having bad weeks of Zoom connectivity. So thanks, Julia, for a very interesting presentation. And my question goes back to Juliette's question and then to your response to that question. So I like this thinking in hegemonic blocks, and I mean, dividing your sample into these hegemonic blocks. But then if I'm not mistaken, your regression results then present averages across these blocks. And so I was wondering whether you also experimented with subsample estimates where you divide the countries into these different blocks, and then maybe also for spillovers between these blocks. So looking at how changes in the average of one block influence outcomes in the other. And then also perhaps looking at how the behavior of the hegemonic country within one block influences the behavior of other countries. Then my second question was also more nitpicky about the data. So in my experience with VDEM data, there's usually very strong autocorrelation in these variables, so they don't change a lot over time. And I was wondering whether you experimented with models that account for autocorrelation, for example, by controlling for lagged values of the dependent variable. But those are my main questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for these great questions, and very clear. I could hear you very clearly, so that's perfect. So yeah, I love this suggestion of trying to sort of divide up the sample. I haven't done that, so it's a good idea to look into that. And I also love the idea of trying to think a little bit about sort of the behavior of the hegemon in a given block, right? And so I think some ways of doing that might be to maybe look at, how the democracy score of that country evolves over time, right? One could imagine sort of the hegemon in the bloc, or also kind of looking at as maybe the most autocratic member, right? And trying to sort of use that as a measure. So, you know, I love this idea of trying to tease that apart a little bit, but I haven't yet looked into it. I appreciate the note on autocorrelation over time, and I haven't included a lagged DV, but I should. You know, my experience has been that sometimes it absorbs so much of the variation that's in there, but I should certainly try a more sort of dynamic panel model as well. I will say I tried some sort of two-way fixed effects models too, right? And a lot of the core findings are very consistent, especially sort of the illiberal IGO measure is very consistent. Some of the measures that are not as consistent in this sort of more conservative model are international NGOs, in part, I think, because they, you know, a lot of the variation is over time in those, right? I think in many ways, I think of the rise of international NGOs as sort of like a substantive measure for time, right? And so that wasn't quite as reassuring as I'd hoped, but I should try a more dynamic panel model too. And I will say I've used the VDEM data a lot for independent variables, but this is my first time sort of exploring it with a dependent one, right, and using an expert coded measure. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I'm sort of discovering all these little artifacts that come up. So I appreciate the point about autocorrelation. Thank you. All right, I think
I have a question from the chat that I can read, so that you can you see it? Oh, I'll read it. Alex asked, do you have a view on the proposed UK law which would fine universities or allow speakers to sue universities if they are cancelled? Was officially a law to enforce free speech, does it amount to academic repression as it curbs universities' powers to decide who speaks?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for this question, Alex. And, you know, it's a really interesting one. And I think it's one that, you know, it's come up in the US context a lot as well, too, right? When I talk to people about this project, one of the kind of things that people are grappling with are, you know, instances in which speakers are sort of, you know, their presentations are being cancelled by a university, sometimes in response to sort of student protest. And you know, I think it's, in many ways, it opens a whole can of worms, because I think on one hand, you know, I think it's a tough question, because it does, you know, I do believe that on university campuses, we do want free speech, right? We do want a sort of exchange of knowledge, right? We want an exchange of opinion that is, you know, that often involves exchanging with people that you might fundamentally disagree with, right? And I think the university is a space where those exchanges sort of, you know, I think can and should take place. But at the same time, as you say, you know, I think there's also an element of, you know, I think sometimes it's sort of part of a conservative backlash against the university, right? And so I think in many ways, even though it's framed as protecting academic freedom, it is actually part of a sort of broader attempt to try and reassert some control over the university, right? Which is seen as sort of taken over by these liberal indoctrinating forces. And so, you know, I realize I'm giving a non-answer to your question, which must be very, very frustrating. But I think ultimately, you know, I'm agreeing with the tension that you're pointing to in your question, right? I think there are dimensions in which it is tied to questions of academic freedom, but I think it is also bound up in a sort of broader pattern where, you know, I mean, in the United States especially, I mean, there's a huge backlash, for instance, against teaching critical race theory on university campuses, right? And so, you know, I think it is also bound up with a sort of conservative backlash. And, you know, I will say I don't know the UK situation as well, right? But thinking about that sort of in the US context, you know, that's how I've been thinking about it. But I will say, sort of just as a side note, and maybe taking your question into a direction where maybe I can say more, you know, I think in many ways the talk today, I've focused sort of on challenges from the right, right? So like autocratic challenges, right? But I do think the university in many places is also experiencing a sort of crisis of legitimacy that extends to the left as well, right? Where there are sort of, there's a questioning of, you know, sort of the universality of academic knowledge, right? And so I think in many ways, you know, the picture that I've presented today, it's sort of one side of the picture, right? Like I'm not equivocating between these challenges, but I think there's something a little bit broader going on where the university as an institution is experiencing a lot of challenges of legitimacy, you know, for instance, be it from the perspective of, you know, in the United States, for instance, and in Canada, sort of centering Indigenous knowledge, right, and actually realizing the ways in which the university as an institution, you know, the claims to universality are based on a sort of particular worldview. Does that make sense? And so I think the question of academic freedom, you know, like your question pointed to, it's a lot more complex, right, than the sort of sliver that I've focused on in the talk. And I see, maybe I'll stop here because I feel like I still haven't answered your question. Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. And there's a lot of questions that have popped up. So hopefully I'll do a better job at answering those.
I'll ask
Emre.
one of Emre. I got him.
Oh, sorry. I feel like I was interrupting.
Thank you. Sorry. Juliet, did you want to ask a question first?
You can go ahead. I already had one.
Okay. So yeah, my question's more about this really seems like a historical story you are telling. And so in adopting stats to answer some of these like broader patterns in history, one of the challenges seems that a lot of the variables we talk about are related to each other. They cannot be easily parceled out. So when we talk about the Cold War era, sure, there is the illiberalism, but the illiberalism also provokes and the PACS, various nation states forms, also induces them to become members in these illiberal organizations. So in effect, some of the variables included in the models are related to each other. Mm-hmm. So how do you approach using this particular method? And maybe a bit more than that question, why did you adopt to use stats to answer the question at hand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. You know, I think it's a really good question, and I think this has been one of the papers where I've sort of delved the most into history, right? I'm not a historian, and so maybe I'm, you know, a little bit on thin ice. But a lot of the dynamics that I've been thinking about in my work, they think about the world as a unit and how it evolves over time, right? And so it has this really sort of qualitative and historical dimension to it. And you know, I think you're right that in some sense there can be a sort of tension between sort of trying to capture what are really, you know, in reality, complex sort of intersecting empirical forces that evolve in a sort of qualitative manner over time through, you know, regression. And I think So a few answers to your questions. So, you know, one way of trying to grapple with these interconnections, and I think you're absolutely right, you know, I mean, separating the domestic from the international. Oh, as I said, it's been the bane of my existence, you know, and I think the variables are very correlated. You know, you could argue that we're just capturing domestic things, and, you know, and so one way out of that is, which, you know, is not what you're envisioning, right? But it would be to try and really sort of ramp up the models, right? So trying to do a little bit more causal inference, to try and really tease apart, like, you know, what part of the variation is really about these global dynamics. And we've steered away from that a little bit, just because, you know, we don't want to be thinking about this in a hardwired way, right? So as I said, I don't think it's that any of these organizations is sort of the causal force here, right? It's a proxy. So, you know, I realized that that was not the spirit of your question, but that would be one way to go. I mean, I think, you know, in justification of why go the quantitative route when you're trying to capture, in many ways, a qualitative evolution of the, you know, over time, I think, you know, one answer is I'm trained as a quantitative sociologist, right? And so it's the kind of work that, you know, I know how to do. And so it's easier for me to kind of think about it in this way, right? And I think the reason why I like doing this kind of work is because I do think there's something that's added, right, by looking at so many observations over time, right? And I think that's not to say that case-based analyses couldn't illuminate this storyline. I think they could, you know, and maybe, as you say, even better. But I do think this sort of bird's eye picture that we get using these data. And then, you know, one final note, I think quantitative research has kind of come to, at least in the United States with sociology, you know, it's become quite narrow over time, you know, where I think it's very much about getting effect sizes. It's very much about sort of, you know, I don't know, rational choice models. And, you know, I think in many ways what gets lost is that there is a tradition of sort of quantitative historical research too, right? And so I think I also want to bring that back to sort of the quantitative domain, right? Where I think it is really worthwhile thinking about these sort of macro social and macro sociological issues using quantitative data, right? So that quantitative data doesn't just become something that's about, you know, I don't know, like how particular questions might be answered on a survey at a given point in time, right? You know, I'm exaggerating, but I think that's part of sort of the motivation. Okay, I see that we're a little bit pressed for time, so maybe we'll move on. But thank you so much, Emery, for this really, really good question. All right, I think Matthias is the other question. Is that right?
Yeah, I was curious. I mean, you're talking about, and that in a way builds on Emre's questions. You're looking at long run, broad historical processes, but then you use country years as your unit of analysis and statistical analysis. And I understand the practical reasons for doing that, but I was wondering, have you played around with using country decades rather than country years in order to do justice that, you know, the diffusion of these global norms and models around the university probably doesn't happen from one year to the next, or it doesn't change that quickly. So I mean, how do you deal with these issues of temporality and duration? And the second one, I was wondering about, so for the liberal models, you look at INGOs, and for the illiberal models, you look at IGOs. But these are a little bit different types of organizations. And I'm asking this because INGOs have you know, like Oxfam or Amnesty International, I mean, they can choose whom they allow as members, yeah. And so if a state is kicked out or not let in, that's not, you know, that's basically not under the control of that state. Whereas in IGOs, you know, if you're not part of a particular club, you can make up your own. I mean, the example is Hugo Chavez in Latin America. He didn't like the Organization of American States that excluded Cuba, and it's supposed like American liberalism. Then he formed UNASUR and ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliances for Americas, as an alternative. Yeah, so their states have, I mean, you see states have agency, and the number, yeah, so the IGOs that would kind of enter into your model are affected by that. So I was wondering how you're handling that issue.
Yeah, thank you so much for both excellent questions and excellent suggestions. And also, I had not thought about doing country decade, but that seems like a, you know, a great thing to look at. You know, I think it'll reduce the sample, but definitely, you know, that seems to be something that's maybe a little bit more in line with some of the long run processes. You know, I will say, sort of thinking conceptually and theoretically, we should be doing our analyses at the world level, right? Because a lot of the story is about the evolution of the world over time. And, you know, one of my colleagues, David Frank, he has in the past done this, right? I think, you know, there's very little appetite, I think, in journals for these kinds of analyses, just because the sample sizes tend to be really small. But country decade is maybe a little bit more manageable. I will say, and Juliette will know this because she read the paper, and you know, every time that I present this, I kind of try out different things, and but Juliette will have seen that actually some of the analyses that we've done, rather than trying to use sort of time period dummies to capture these global eras, we've actually constructed sort of indices at the world level of how influential illiberal models are at a given point in time, right? For instance, the proportion of democracies in the world at a given point in time, right? The proportion of countries in the world that are members of an illiberal IGO. And it works, you know, generally quite well, and as well as the period effects. It's just, I've found that like sometimes people really don't like sort of world level measures, right, that only vary over time. And so that just as a side note, but the country decade is a great suggestion. And then yes, you know, the question, you have INGOs for one thing and IGOs for the other. And yeah, absolutely. You know, I do think they're different beasts. I hadn't thought about it in the exact ways that you've raised here, but I think that's a really good and important point. You know, I mean, I think it's worth keeping in mind. As you say, like, you know, international NGOs, it's like, it's people that are members, right? And so it seems like fundamentally a different kind of thing. And I will say, we've tried in analyses that we've done much more recently, sort of alternative measures of connectedness to liberal norms in the international system that are a little bit more state-based as well. So we've looked at the number of human rights treaties that a given country has signed in a given point in time, you know, sort of thinking that this is another measure of the degree to which countries are connected. And that measure sort of works very similarly to the INGO measure in terms of, you know, how it affects academic freedom. But I think it's maybe a little bit more closely in line with, you know, having a state-based measure for the illiberal dimension too, right? And I think, you know, international NGOs, it's been used for a long time to capture connections to dominant global models, but there's obviously all kinds of organizations that are involved, right? And that don't necessarily have anything to do with liberalism, right? Whereas maybe sort of the participation in the international human rights regime is maybe a better measure. And so just, you know, as a side note, that we have tried that, and I think maybe it's a little bit more defensible, if that makes sense. But yeah, thank you so much for these questions. This has just been so helpful. You know, I feel like just getting sort of fresh eyes on the situation and sort of new suggestions. And I just really appreciate that you're all here, you know, Monday night sharing your time with me.
Thanks so much, Julia, for the presentation. And I'm sure that we will also have things to discuss with the ethnic goods team, because we often discuss like expert surveys versus other types of data. So sure be another occasion to discuss that. And thank you to everyone, and have a nice evening, rest of your day, maybe for you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming and for inviting me. This was just really fun, and I just appreciate sort of, you know, the care and interest with which you all listened and made such thoughtful suggestions. And thank you, Juliette, and thank you, Helena, for, you know, managing the session.
Thank you.